Good morning. Today is February 6th, and my topic was to deal with the Middle East. But before I deal with some of the issues I was meant to be addressing, obviously the big news out of the Middle East are the horrendous earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. Very serious earthquakes. If you didn't listen to the news this morning, 7.8 and 6, I think, 7.6. Huge amount of damage, no doubt. I think by now they said 3,000 people have been killed, but there are going to be very many more. And as always happens in these cases, the world tries to help, assist, and send groups of experts and dogs and all the rest of it. But the destruction is so great, and it's winter there, and the human need of just keeping people from freezing to death on the street who are homeless by the thousands, hundreds of thousands, is going to be a challenge. And of course, this is in a challenging part of the world. So, for example, in Syria, it's northern Syria. If you look at the map, there's Turkey and then northern Syria, have both been hit. You know, who's going to help Syria at this point? Well, obviously the Russians are in Syria and they will help, but people who are hostile to the Russians because of the war in Ukraine will kind of also want to step up for one reason or another. And interestingly enough, the Israelis have said that they would send help. But it's useful to know here that the Israelis have been in contact and cooperation with the Russians in Syria all along. And the Israelis have, on the one hand, Western links and links with the US, but they also have links with Russia, which are fairly complicated, which I'll get to in a minute. But one of the things, of course, is that Russia still has a large Jewish population, and the Israelis have been very careful not to alienate the Russians so that they do harm to the Russian Jews still in Russia. So it's a complicated part of the world to begin with, but it's also complicated in terms of aiding the country because of the split, Shiite Sunni split, East-West split, the Ukrainian war, and all the rest. So here's a good case in point where you can see that the various patterns and dynamics in the world at any given point impact not just bilateral, multilateral relations, but also impact what one does about a massive humanitarian crisis in a very volatile part of the world. So it bears watching, not just for the horror of what has happened to the people there, but also in terms of the international dynamic of helping both countries. So let me then go to the topic per se and maybe start with talking about Israel. Talking about Israel is always both a challenge and a problem. As soon as one criticizes Israel, there are cries of anti-Semitism, etc. But as students of politics, we need to address Israel like any other country, and both in its domestic and international context. For those of you who are readers of the hard copy New York Times, you might have seen a single page ad, huge one-page ad, put by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, which says, "Democracy can die in daylight too." In short, the more progressive and liberal forces in Israel are terribly concerned about the current government in Israel. Now, I think I want to say two things about it, even though I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time talking about Israeli domestic policies. But as you all know, an extreme right-wing government is now in power. And that right-wing government contains people who are not just conservative, but who are radical in their hostility to anything resembling a two-state solution, to anything resembling Palestinian rights, to anything resembling imagining that Palestinians have any rights on the West Bank. For example, they are encouraging the settlers on the West Bank to set up new settlements. When in the current government and the head of security, who is one of these right-wingers, within a right-wing government, when one of a Palestinian was accused of committing a crime, they went to the house of his family and ousted the family and destroyed the house. So this is not just punishing individuals for crimes against Israelis, but punishing the family and destroying Palestinian houses and so forth. So for anybody interested in democracy, the whole attitude towards the future of Israel and Palestinian is once again on center. And the reason that the Israeli newspaper is so concerned about democracy is that one of the things the Israeli government is trying to do is to undermine and change the independence of the Israeli court. The court, which the Israeli equivalent of the parliament, is meant to be able to overrule any decision made by the court. Now, this happens to be fairly convenient for Prime Minister Netanyahu because he's currently on trial in Israel. So if this were to happen, what you would have is a situation. Let's say the court finds him guilty of some or all of the crimes of which he is financial crimes of which he is accused, and then he could get the parliament to simply overturn the ruling against him, right? So there is a real concern that the checks and balances of the government of Israel can be removed or can be eroded if the court no longer has a right and a role, I might say, to overturn legislation. Or find individuals guilty where the legislature can then overturn those rulings. So there's genuine concern on the part of large proportion of the Israeli political spectrum. And you might have seen on TV, there are huge demonstrations in Israel, and there are demonstrations against the current government and against the possible erosion of democracy and against any idea of a two-state solution, et cetera. So this is not just an outsider or, an academic in Santa Cruz or a news journalist calling attention to the problems in the Israeli society and Israeli politics right now, but a substantial number of Israelis, anyone who is not extreme right-wing, etc., are appalled by what is currently going on. And it's gotten obviously a lot of focus. So this is happening on the one hand. On the other hand, there is a second track, and that is that what had originally been called the Abraham Accords, which was essentially the Gulf states and other states in the Middle East deciding to support Israel, or at least to withdraw support from the Palestinians. Now, I think it's worth saying that Palestinians, as much as they have gotten the sympathy for their situation in Israel and in the West Bank and in Gaza at various points, Palestinians also were strewn around the Middle East over decades, and some of them then migrated into Israel. But in any event, most countries of North Africa and the Middle East have had experience with Palestinians. And while for decades there has been support on the part of Arab countries for the Palestinian cause, underlying this was really, on the one hand, a convenience to be anti-Israel, but also was a, brotherhood of fellow Arabs, fellow Muslims. But there was an undercurrent of, we don't really like the Palestinians all that much anyway. Now, why would people have not liked the Palestinians anyway outside of Israel? Is that, like, let's say, the Lebanese in West Africa, which was a good example during colonialism, the Palestinians were business people and they were very successful. And they were a minority which benefited from during the colonial regimes and were not necessarily well connected with the domestic population. Now, I'm exaggerating a little to make a point here, but in any event, the Palestinians have not been the most popular folks in the Middle East, although on the Arab-Israeli conflicts, they have been supported for decades now. And that support has been pulled out from under them to some extent. It's not that some of the Arab states and the Gulf states are now anti-Israel necessarily, but they also are no longer really supporting the Palestinians wholeheartedly. This obviously will have an impact on the Palestinian cause, but it's also shifting the alliances in the Middle East. I might just add most recently, for example, even a North African country like Morocco, right, which used to be primarily in alliance with France as former colonial power, has just kind of shifted its allegiances to Israel of all countries. And by the same token, France, who for a long time now has been alienated from Algeria, now because Algeria has energy resources, France is in a new and more positive discussion with Algeria. And meantime, Morocco says, well, we're recognizing Israel and we'll have some links with them. Now, this is, on the one hand, all very confusing. On the other hand, it has shuffled the decks in the Middle East. And the question is, why has Israel been so successful, in a sense, eroding the united anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian disposition of so many states in the Middle East? Not all of them yet, but many of them. And I think the answer is a practical one. That is to say, Israel is very good at providing technology, for example, providing not only manufactured technology, but technological know-how. If you recall, we talked about Pegasus some time ago, which is a spy system, which the various authoritarian governments in the Middle East find very useful. And in general, Israel is more useful to the authoritarian leaders in various parts of the Middle East because it gets some benefit from Israel. It gets technological benefits, as I just mentioned, but also military benefits. That is to say, Israel is sending military hardware and software to those countries and is helping the dictatorships of various Middle East countries stay in power and have the tools with which to stay in power. So what you have, and it's really just in the last year or so, is a real shift. That is, say, the isolated Israel that every country in the neighborhood used to, hate and support and oppose, is all of a sudden on sort of practical, pretty good terms with the various governments in the neighborhood, not all of them, but various governments, certainly the Gulf states and some others. And in the meantime, the Palestinians, which had been allied and had been at least given political support, if not economic and technical support from rich neighboring countries in the Gulf, are now getting themselves isolated. So, on the one hand, this is clever Israel. On the other hand, this is self-interested authoritarian government willing to go with whomever can provide the kind of inputs that they would like to have: economic, political, military, technological. So, not only is there now a right-wing government in which the Palestinians have very little future, the Palestinians are also now have lost, in a sense, their support system in the region. Now, whether this is long-term or short-term, I can't tell you, but it is a real shift in the region. Now, Israel comes along with its objectionable right-wing government. And of course, the United States will, on the margin, criticize the anti-democratic forces in Israel right now and its extreme right-wing policies and so forth. On the other hand, the United States will say over and over again, whether it's a democratic or a Republican regime, Israel is our ally. We will support Israel, no matter what. But this is, of course, also in conflict with the democratic values of, let's say, Western Europe and the United States. So everybody, in a sense, is in a quandary for two reasons. One, the situation in the domestic politics of Israel right now, but two, the shifting alliances in the region and what to do with the Palestinians. Now, it's obviously, one can say, the poor Palestinians. On the other hand, and then, of course, supporters of Israel will say, well, the Palestinians are killing Israelis. Yes, the Palestinians now and then kill Israelis, but the numbers are totally disproportionate. 2 Israelis get killed and, 20 Palestinians or more get killed, or in the case when it's from Gaza, whole apartment blocks are torn down and perfectly innocent civilians are living in them. So the disproportionate response against Palestinian crimes and violence on the part of Israel has been of long-term standing. And of course, Israel has far more capacity to do major damage to Palestinian, especially in Gaza, but also in other places. So that's that. There's nothing new about that. What is new about it is that it's hard to imagine, if you want to look at it in a sort of relatively fair perspective, it's hard to imagine how the Palestinians are going to get their act together and not, suffer one defeat after another. Whose fault is the weakness of the Palestinians to make any kind of inroads or progress? Well, in large part, it is a Palestinians' fault. The governance of the West Bank is appalling. Their authority is not functioning. Their head is ancient and not very on top of things. So rather than the Palestinians being able to present themselves as well-organized, well-structured, reasonable negotiating partners, the Palestinians are in complete disarray. So you have sort of tiers of it. A mess inside of Israel based on its extreme right-wing government, a shifting of alliances in the Middle East, especially in the Gulf states, but also North Africa and other states. Um, an attempt by the Israelis to maintain their Western support and alliances. And if all else fails, you can say, remember the Holocaust, and you get a lot of sympathy. On the other hand, much of the West, the United States and Europe, are now in a conflict with Russia at a very time in which, for a variety of reasons, the Israelis are in some form of, to some extent, shaded, but to some extent in the open alliances with Russia. And as I mentioned, it's both because of concern about Jews in Russia and how they're treated by the Russians, and they don't want revenge on the part of Russians. And on the other hand, it is a situation where arms and trade and so forth is important, going back and forth between Israel and the Russians. And it is also the case that the Israelis have been in cahoots, I think is to prejudice a word, alliance, diplomatic negotiations for some time with the Russians over Syria, because it is the Russians who essentially determine Syrian policy. And insofar as there's concern in Israel about Syria and the border and all the rest of it, a negotiation with the Russians, just as now after the earthquake, the Russians are central to dealing with Syria and its earthquake damage. So the Russians have, in a sense, insinuated themselves in the Middle East, very much through Syria, but then that implicates and goes over the border as well to Israel. I know you can say, well, you keep on talking about this. This is all very messy and all very confusing. But I'm not just presenting it in a confusing way. It is remarkably confusing right now, right? So, and it is not just confusing for Europeans, it is confusing for people in the region. One of the things I won't get to is some other countries like Turkey and Egypt and so forth. I think I'll have to have a second session on the topic of the Middle East, because there are changes there too, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, and so on. But it is also very problematic for U.S. policy. I mean, the biggest country for U.S. aid, believe it or not, military and to some extent even otherwise, is in fact Israel, right? And now we learn, last week, the week before, that the U.S. actually has weapon depots in Israel. These are not weapons given to Israel, but American-controlled weapon depots, which presumably means it could take those weapons or ask the Israeli government for the U.S. to take out those weapons to be used by someone in Europe, NATO perhaps, against the Ukrainians. So even there, the integration to some extent and policy interests of the United States in Israel is multifaceted, right? On the one hand, you want to criticize the government and its human rights violations. On the other hand, you're preaching a two-state solution and you want some kind of solution for the Palestinians. On the other hand, you are in alliance with various Gulf states for energy and other things. They've now thrown their lot in with Israel. That is actually, in some ways, you might say, well, that's a good position for the U.S. to be dealing with. That is to say, there's no Israeli bashing going on the part of the Gulf states and so on. But it also means that there is beginning to be a sense of independence or disaggregation in that part of the world from the U.S. and its essential role in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, Israel, and other things in that part of the world. And I would say that if looked at from the moon or Mars or somewhere, what is going on in just the part of the Middle East that I'm talking about today would be seen to some extent as a weakening and reduced influence on the part of the United States, where actors, Gulf actors, Iranians, which I'll talk about another time, Turks and so forth, all are sort of in Egypt, all are sort of going into somewhat neutral with respect to NATO and Western roles with respect to Ukraine and Russia. It's one thing for everybody to say that you should not enter the sovereign territory of another country and to criticize Russia about that. It's another thing, though, to wholeheartedly support NATO and the US in its position in the Ukraine. So part of what is happening in the world and happening in the Middle East is somewhat stepping back on less dependence on the United States, though it could dependence on U.S. could quickly reemerge in different ways. One can think of different scenarios. But it's also showing a kind of weakening of the U.S. position in world affairs, where all kinds of changes are taking place, sometimes consistent with U.S. policy and wishes, sometimes inconsistent, but in any event, running on a parallel track in a way that is different than has been the case for some decades. And that's worth paying some attention to. Now, the big actors, of course, in that part of the world nowadays are ones that have energy resources. On the one hand, Gulf states, Algeria, etc. On the other hand, those that have arms, Russia, influence in that part of the world, in Syria, but also where else you get arms from if you're some other countries. Clearly, Israel gets arms and has arms, technological links with the United States, but that was not necessarily true of all the Gulf states. So it's technology, it's arms, it's energy resources, which of course are a spin-off of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it's the US trying hard to be a consistent friend of Israel while criticizing some of what's going on right now, trying to have good relations with the Gulf states and other states, and being nervous about Turkey. Turkey right now, given the earthquake, is in disarray. But in any event, after all, Turkey also went into somewhat, it's a member of NATO, but went to some extent into neutral and not supporting the US and NATO policy in every way in the Ukraine. Then there's somewhat out of control Iran. Iran is sending arms to drones to the Russians to be used in Ukraine. Turkey has sent planes. So what you're seeing there is a lot of sort of independent actors on one side or another, not necessarily siding with Russia, but certainly not necessarily siding with the US anymore. And what I tried to want to sketch for you today, among other things, is the sort of the weakening of the position of the US in the Middle East and North Africa in many ways. I am not saying US influence has gone away. What I am saying is that a lot of these countries are acting somewhat independently, and that includes Israel, right? Because on the one hand, the US has preached for a long time that Israel should get along with in its neighborhood. And in various ways over the years, it has tried. But its alliances nowadays and its supplying of needed technology and arms and so forth is really quite different than it was a few years ago. So, what I've sketched this morning, I'm sorry to be sounding so confusing, is a very confused, very volatile, and very kind of viscous situation in the Middle East. And as I said, I haven't even gotten to Turkey and Iran and others as yet. I will try to address those in the future. Thank you very much for listening, and stay tuned for the daily news from the Middle East. Bye.